Hello there, Evie here. Today we're checking out the Thermalright Macho Rev.B and the Legrand Macho RT. I was only supposed to be reviewing the Rev.B, but last minute I was able to get the RT from Amazon for a rather princely price of £87. Hopefully I'll be able to recuperate some of that when I come to sell it. Anyway, this is the last video in our 160mm cooler category showdown. You can check this list here to see all the coolers we're checking out. I've done the 120s, the 80, and we're finishing off the 160s today. Each of the winners of these categories will be coming forward with us to do future more in-depth case reviews compared to what we were doing before. I mean, I do in-depth case reviews. They can span up to 50 minutes long and check out every little individual bit, but I want to do more in terms of testing to get a more realistic answer for people in terms of how they perform. Anyway, so this is the last in that 160mm cooler category. If you want to check out previous ones, you can go to the top right hand corner and check them out there. So if you want to check out the price in your region and hope it's not as expensive as £87, then you can go to the affiliate links in the video description for Amazon and you can check out what the price is in your region. If you pick up anything through there, you can buy things like rice and stuff on there, but if you go through those links and buy things like the cooler or rice, then it will give a kickback to the channel between 4 and 12% depending on your region. So thanks for checking this one out. I hope you enjoy the video. If I didn't cover anything in this video, or if there's anything I didn't cover in this video, then please let me know in the comments, and if you have any questions specific to those things, and I'll do my best to answer and help out. So without further ado, thanks for checking this one out, and I'll catch you in a second to start with the unboxing. Just before we break into these coolers, I wanted to present how big these 160mm boxes can get. This is also a great opportunity to say that if you want to see any other reviews of any of these coolers, you can head to the CPU Cooler Review playlist. Anyway, we're not here for boxes, we're here for coolers, and here we have two of the largest from Thermalright. The Rev.B is something like their third or fourth largest, and the RT is their largest cooler, at least at the time of recording. It's at this point that we need to introduce these prompts in the corners of the screen now. These will help to keep track of which cooler is to the left, right, top or bottom of the screen as we go through this double review. If you lose track of which you're looking at, just check the corners of the screen. Something you might not be aware of is Thermalright's love for the colour green. Anyway, breaking out these coolers and their contents, there is quite a lot to go through, and yes, the RT is either lacking confidence or a balanced design. I guess we'll find out later during thermal testing. First, we'll cover the tertiary and secondary elements as we build up to the coolers themselves. In terms of packaging, it's closed cell foam all round, and for coolers of this size and weight, it's understandable. The Rev.B has gone for a panel-based approach, whereas the RT has a custom cut-to-fit shell. Moving on to the accessories boxes, we've essentially got the same layout for both coolers. Manuals and accessories boxes to start, and breaking open the accessories boxes presents a lot of other similarities. I'll break the suspense of your spot the difference game, but if you don't like spoilers, then you might want to pause the video now. First difference are the fan clip styles of these coolers, both of which are unusual in their own ways, which we'll cover more later. But it's worth noting that the Rev.B has two sets of fan clips, but they're unlikely to work with many other fans than the ones that are included. Next difference is the thermal paste. The RT comes with a more fancy Chill Factor 3 thermal paste, whereas the Rev.B comes with what appears to be a bog standard Chill Factor. Apparently CF3 or Chill Factor 3 has a lower thermal resistance value, which is better than that of the original, and I'd sort of hope so. But none of which matters for the purposes of this review, as we'll be using our control thermal paste Arctic MX2, which has a higher thermal conductivity value of 5.6 watts per meter Kelvin over the CF3's 3.5 watts per meter Kelvin. Moving on, that was way too much talk about thermal paste. The rest of the contents of these two coolers is identical. The backplate and fan mounting parts, the backplate itself and electrically insulating cover that's not permanently fixed to it, but a bit of double-sided tape could fix that. The top bracket and hold-down plate is also the same for both coolers, as well as the mounting nuts and screws, all of which makes complete sense as they have the same backplate dimensions, and with that, identical mounting steps. As for the fans, they're nearly identical in terms of specs, but apparently the Rev.B's fan is slightly louder while running at the same 300 to 1300 RPM. We'll see about that later. And not forgetting the screwdriver, both coolers come with the same one to access the screw in the mounting plate later. Not as necessary as some other coolers' screwdrivers like the H5 Universal, since the holes in these coolers are so large you could fit any screwdriver down that is long enough. So that's the accessories box covered. Let's move on to the coolers themselves. To the right we have the Macho Rev.B, and to the left we have the Legrand Macho RT. Running through an overview of the similarities and differences, starting up top, there's a slightly different hold-down plate access shaft, both of which are oversized for the job and could be reduced to improve thermals a touch. When it comes to heat pipes, this is where the RT starts flexing its 300 watt TDP capability with its 7 heat pipes, and the 240 watt TDP Rev.B is slumming it with only 6 heat pipes, which is pretty standard for many 160mm coolers. In terms of raw dimensions, the RT is 150mm wide, which is a good 10mm wider than the Rev.B. This translates into a slightly misaligned central shaft, and of course a 10mm wide offset to the opposing face. Now I just said there's a misaligned shaft between the Rev.B and RT coolers, but that's not strictly true. It's actually the base plate that's misaligned by the same amount as the increased width, 10mm. More on this later. The Rev.B is the taller of the two, standing here at 162mm tall. 3mm shorter is the Legrand Macho RT at 159mm tall. The RT makes up for this slight height difference by accommodating 31 full fins as well as an additional 3 half-size fins, where the Rev.B has only 30 full fins. Of course, the major difference between these coolers is the depth, so the Rev.B stands with a self-supporting depth of 102mm. The RT, on the other hand, laughs at this figure to a point of falling over and in need of support with a total depth of 120mm. That's more than the width of most coolers on the market. A minor detail barely worth mentioning is the folded fin edge of the Rev.B, which is something the RT has been manufactured without, but both coolers appear to be doing the majority of their airflow guidance with an array of short fins throughout the fin stack. This should do a great job of maintaining a linear airflow path, but this could also increase the noise produced by the air flowing through the stack, as the amount of leading edges confronting the airflow has been substantially increased. Following up on the point made earlier about the offset base of the RT, this shot should give you a good visual representation of this design. Notice the slight difference in the bending of the heat pipes from the left and the right side of the RT cooler. It's also here that you can see the Rev.B's fin stack has been pushed towards the rear of the cooler to maintain full RAM compatibility. The RT also has the same treatment, but the extra heat pipe and deeper fin stack has pushed it over the edge of asymmetrical stability, but the Rev.B is now just showing off. Since the base plate is the same design on both coolers, we only need to cover this once. The Rev.B and RT follow the standard aluminium top plate and a lower nickel-plated copper base plate that clamp onto the heat pipes that run through. The base plate itself has been finished to a mirror sheen. Well, sort of. This one seemed a touch dirty, so it was worth giving it a quick spray and clean while we're at this stage. Speaking of which, does this 30 FPS half-speed footage work for you in the context of a 60 frames per second video? Let me know in the comments if you have an opinion either way. So with a freshly clean base plate, we can tell by the reflections of the grid that it's not completely flat, but it is very smooth. Being flatter is more important than smoothness, but in this case it looks like we have a convex surface, which shouldn't negatively affect performance too much. If it was concaved, we'd have more problems. And just to reiterate, the base plate dimensions are identical between the Rev.B and RT coolers. Okay, we're super close to installing these things, but there are a couple of differences still to cover. You may recall I mentioned the Rev.B cooler has 30 full fins in its stack, whereas the RT has 31 full fins and 3 half fins. These half fins are a little unusual, but there's good reasoning behind their shape. They only run through the first 3 heat pipes, since the rear 4 heat pipes are angled reaching back to the fin stack at this level, and it's not an ideal shape to mount a fin to. Okay, last stop before installation. These things generally carry on quite a lot. These aren't even very big things to cover. Anyway, the manual is pretty thorough, although it's very text heavy, but the illustrations make everything clear enough. I can't speak for other languages, and on that note I can't speak any other languages, but the English isn't exactly clean. I mean, choose the platform you are in use is wrong, but you kind of get the idea. This should all be translated and checked though, considering how much you have to pay for one of these things. So let's actually install this thing. Here's everything required, roughly laid out in steps, apart from the couple of screws for the hold down plate that I didn't lay out. So without further ado, starting off with the fan preparation, 4 adhesive rubber pads need to be placed in the corners of the fin stack. Then these rather unusual fan clips need slotting through the holes in the top and bottom of the fin stack. It's worth starting from the top so you don't accidentally scrape the finish away when you have to wrangle the other side of the clip in place. It does require some force, and overall it's not a very elegant or practical way to hold a fan to a heatsink. It works, but I don't want to see this style of fan clip again anytime soon. Moving on to the base plate preparation, this too is more complicated than most other backplates. 4 long screws need feeding through the backplate from the rear, then the mylar sheet, which is a brand name for the material PET, which is plastic, needs to be laid on top and is held in place with some plastic washers. Again, like with the fan clips, other companies like Noctua with their Secufirm backplate means all of this work is not required. It's not awful, it does work, but it's been done better on other products. So the backplate can now be offered up to the rear of the motherboard, and with some support it can be fixed in place with the set of nuts to the front of the motherboard. These nuts have nylon washers that are pre-fixed to the motherboard side to prevent wear and tear to the face of the motherboard. This approach would have also been nice for the backplate. Again, something that a more elaborate backplate would eliminate is the need to tighten up the screws from the back as well as the nuts from the front. This sounds nitpicky now, but in many cases, access behind the motherboard tray isn't always an option. So if a screw decides to spin rather than grip during a cooler's removal, some quick diagnosis of problems with the CPU socket could be a royal pain. And back round to the front, the mounting bracket needs installing into the previously installed nuts with a set of screws. For thermal paste, like I mentioned earlier, we're using Arctic MX2 as our control thermal paste. All coolers are tested on this channel with MX2 so we can eliminate performance differences based on the thermal paste. I don't know about you, but I'm more interested in the design and performance of the cooler over the different thermal paste that gets shipped with all these coolers. We're also using a stupidly large amount since we don't know how well this mounting solution will work, and I want to ensure full coverage for thermal testing later. We'll see how this all spread out in the thermal paste check section later, just before we check the thermal testing results. Now here's something I don't normally do. We're flipping the test bench onto its back to give us a horizontal motherboard to fix to. We're also removing the RAM and graphics card, but that's more so we can get a better look at the installation over anything else. Something that got me a little anxious was the centering of my thermal paste application, so I decided to add a small strip to the side to make sure it was balanced. Just to reiterate, I don't recommend using this much ordinarily since most of the time it's a waste. This is just for testing purposes. With the thermal paste nicely centered, the cooler can now be lowered into position, and the hold down plate can be positioned over the base plate while making sure the screw holes align with the mounting bracket below. The hold down plate doesn't get fixed to the base plate at all here. This mounting solution relies on the friction between all the elements below the hold down plate to maintain the cooler's position. So as with most coolers, it's a back and forth between the screws to achieve an even spread of thermal paste and pressure across the socket. I don't think it would be realistic to install this cooler to a vertically mounted motherboard since the hold down plate would probably be a pain to work with, so if you were planning on getting either of these coolers, make sure you keep this in mind. As for the fan, the pre-installed clips need to be lightly pulled over, and the kink in the clip is supported by the slot in the mounting holes of the fan's bracket. They look simple enough to work with, but the pressures are so light it's tricky to work out when the fan is mounted correctly. Also bear in mind, these fan clips are designed for 120mm fan mount spacings. However, there wasn't enough thickness to the frame of the 120mm Vada fans I tried off air, so if you plan to change this fan out for a couple of 120mm fans, you need to make sure the plastic sections the clips hold onto is at least 5.5mm thick. Anyway, we can now connect the fan to the CPU fan header, and I'd normally mention it before this point, but the wire has a plastic braided sleeve, which is just fine, but the connector itself looks like an aged white plastic, which is not so good. So just before we fire the system up, the RAM and graphics cards need to be slotted back into position, and now we can fire the system up. I'd normally go into the noise testing now, but there's a couple of reasons why that's not happening just yet. Instead, we're going to cover the installation of the Legrand Macho RT, just pointing out some things to look out for that are different, but most of it's the same. Something that makes my life instantly easier is that the mounting bracket is identical to that of the Rev.B, so I don't need to change anything but the cooler. However, there are a couple of things that need pointing out. If you intend to use this cooler with a mini ITX build, I can't say I'd recommend it since aligning the base plate over the IHS of an ITX board sees the RT overhang the IO by a good 5mm. Of course, my quick mock-up of the installation doesn't look great, but it's hard to ignore that this cooler would be a pain to install into a small form factor system. Mind you, saying that, isn't that the case with most high-end small form factor systems? Here you can see the 48mm rear RAM clearance though for an 8 RAM slot motherboard. So as for the actual installation, I didn't go crazy with the thermal paste this time round, but it's still quite a lot more than is required by most coolers. Lowering the RT into position, extra care should be taken during installation due to this cooler's constant need to fall over. The hold down plate was actually preventing this from falling over entirely there, but apart from that, there's nothing different to mounting the RT over the Rev.B. However, the fan mounting technique is a little different to that of the Rev.B, and I have no idea why. The fan clips loosely hook onto the sides of the fin stack and then need to latch onto the holes in the frame of the fan. The connection once both sides are in place is pretty strong, more so than that of the Rev.B fan clips, but these ones suffer from the same issues as the Rev.B fan clips insofar as they only support 120mm fan mounting spacings, but since these have proper hooks and a higher mounting pressure, they should work better for most 120mm fans. So as with the Rev.B, it's time to hook up the fan to the motherboard, replace the RAM and graphics card, and now we can get into some noise testing of both the coolers, as well as the thermal paste application check and the thermal testing results. Okay, so minor screw up on my part. The previous acoustic testing will be a bit null and void at this point. This fan here is the TY147B, and that's on the Macho, the Legrand Macho. And the one that I used before was this fan. I should have been using the TY147A. TY-147A, but instead I had the B on there instead of, I had the B on the Rev.B and not on the Legrand Macho RT, and I should have had the B on the RT, not the A. This is the B, and I've also got the Rev.B, you can bet. I've also got the Rev.B here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to position them in the same place, and I'm going to hold it, so we're going to have this one running at its lowest speed of 300 RPM, there or thereabouts. I'll call out the numbers just before I do them. I'll also have the reference click, which you'll have by each fan. The microphone is lined down the center of these two, so with any luck we'll have some sort of test results that are semi-successful. So yeah, so I'm going to give this a shot now. That'll be running first, the RT will run first, and that will run at 300 RPM, and then I'll do the Rev.B, and then we'll shift up to 60%, and then 100%. So this is running at 330 RPM. This is the RT. So you didn't hear the previous testing results because that's no point in showing those as well. Barely any noise at all. Yeah, barely any noise at all. You wouldn't hear this inside a case for certain. A very tiny amount, if you're very tiny amount of noise if you're here. Not sure if that's motor noise or if that's just air noise. I'm not entirely sure. It's very quiet, so it's hard to tell. So what we'll do is we'll switch over now to the RT, which I will be holding, but I'll remain as still as I possibly can. We'll see how it goes. So here we have the Rev.B, and that's got the TY147A on it. So this is what it sounds like at 320 RPM. It sounds exactly the same. Let's try 60% on the Rev.B. No, the Macho RT. I want to pull it out there, but I have a feeling it's just going to crash the system. I have done that before. Let's see. Okay, it didn't crash it. Okay, I'm doing it this way. Oh, no, it did crash the system. So the Macho RT is running at 840 RPM at 60% on the PWM fan range. That's exactly where I'd expect it to be, but somewhere between 300 to 1300 RPM, which are the two target markers it gives itself, or Thermalright gives it. So this is what that sounds like at 840 RPM. So a very low hum, nothing too irritating at all. I don't think you'll probably be able to hear a lot of it, if anything. Headphones on to be able to hear this sort of thing, I think. So if you're running it at 60% on your PWM fan curve, whatever you're doing, which is likely the range you'll be using it at when, say, playing maybe some more intensive games, things like that, because it's such a big cooler, you will not be expecting to run this at 100% on the PWM fan curve. So let's switch over to the Rev.B now, and see if its fan is any different. There is a 1 decibel difference between these two fans, this one on the RT being apparently 1 decibel quieter, and both the bottom and top range. So let's switch over now and see what this one sounds like at 60%. So at 60% on the Rev.B, this is what it sounds like. So I can't really tell if there's any noise differences between them. You'll have to tell between these two sound files. I'll play the RT and then the Rev.B. So I'll have an idea after I've heard those audio clips there, which one was better or worse. They were in the same position, I wasn't making any noise when I was holding it, so with any luck, that'll give you a good idea of what it's like at 60% at 850 RPM if you're wondering. So let's kick it up to 100%, see where they sit in terms of speed, around the 1300 RPM range is where we should be hitting, and what they both sound like. So at 100% on the PWM fan range, we're looking at around 1280 RPM, sometimes as low as 1250, sometimes as high as 1290, somewhere around there, within the PWM range that it offers, plus or minus 10%. So this is what that sounds like. So noticeable, not too noisy, quite a low tone in terms of its, well, tone, so not too bad. When it's inside a case, it was running at 100%. You would notice it, but it wouldn't be terrible. It's certainly louder than something like the Dark Rock 4's fan, the Silent Wings, or the version of the Silent Wings fan they have in the Dark Rock 4. Noctua and Be Quiet have got a thing for changing their fan specifications for fans on coolers, which is very irritating for anyone trying to get an identical fan to add to that cooler. Anyway, so we'll switch over to the Rev.B, and then we'll do a switch between the RT and Rev.B sound files, so you can get a bit of an idea of what sounds like what, which one's noisier or quieter, if they're both the same. I have no idea. I'm just trying to compensate for the amount of somethingery that I've been doing here. So let's go over to the Rev.B. Okay, so we're running at 1350 RPM on this fan, so we're running at around, say, 50 to 80 RPM faster than the RT. So this is what it sounds like at around 350, 360 now RPM. So, I will play those sound files. So first we're going to start off with the RT, and then we'll go to the Rev.B, and we'll switch back and forwards twice, so you get a good idea of what each one sounds like. I hope that was useful to you. I have no idea. I'm winging this as badly as possible. Let's move on to the thermal testing results. A bit of B-roll of the Macho RT, because that's probably the one that people are most interested in, and we'll cut time, that sort of stuff, on doing both of them. Then we'll go into the thermal paste application of both of these coolers, and then we'll check out the thermal testing results. I'm not sure if you heard any of that over the sound of the fan. So, let's see what they were like. So I hope you enjoyed the B-roll, and apologies about the very disorganized noise testing. I think it still holds some interesting information, however, and I hope the comparative test made up for the madness. Stripping the Rev.B off the motherboard, we can check out the thermal paste application. We'll get onto the RT in a second. On the base plate, we have full overall coverage with plenty of excess all round, and checking the IHS, the same is found to be true, plenty of excess, but mostly left on the base plate of the cooler. As for the RT, there were no problems to be found here. I certainly didn't forget the hold down plate wasn't secured to the cooler, and it definitely didn't almost go through the motherboard. That definitely didn't happen. What definitely did happen, however, was an offset thermal paste application on the base of the cooler. Since there's no sort of central post to maintain the central mounting position, you should probably pay more attention than I did to the cooler's position beneath the hold down plate. But only a small amount of the excess meets the edge, so the IHS was relatively central, or at least wasn't overhanging the base plate. Here's a few more shots detailing the offset of the base plate from the rest of the cooler, which doesn't help with aligning the cooler, so please watch out for this if you get this cooler. Anyway, the IHS thermal paste spread was completely fine, so let's get on with some thermal testing results. So I've run both coolers through the usual 9 tests ranging from games to synthetic benchmarks, and the most demanding test being Prime 95, which we'll cover at the end as a sort of finale. We won't cover all of them, but all the results will be visible to you, so you can pause and analyze the ones I don't discuss. Before we get into that though, I need to run through the testing methodology and the rules of these graphs so we're all on the same page. Feel free to skip ahead of this if you've seen some of these graphs before. Starting with the testing methodology, all fans were running at full speed for all tests. This includes the fans on the GPU. This eliminates any exponential differences in performance due to gradually increasing fan curves. It's also good to know that these results are as good as it gets for this test bench, and you could turn the fan speed down as a trade-off between thermal and acoustic performance. In terms of how the graphs are laid out, the purple bars represent CPU cooler height. This may be replaced in the future with some sort of CPU cooler volume instead, since coolers like the Legrand Macho are very large, but not as tall as the D15S and Dark Rock 4. Anyway, the graph is ordered by cooler height, tallest coolers at the bottom and shortest at the top. There's also a secondary sort by CPU thermal performance, so the graphs will move around a bit from test to test, but I'll be highlighting the talking points so we're all on track. Speaking of thermals, the blue bars represent CPU thermals in degrees Celsius, but they're logged down in a delta T format, meaning the ambient temperature of the room has been subtracted from the CPU package temperature. You could also add 20 to 25 degrees to get an idea of the true temperatures, but for comparison's sake, delta T figures are easier to work with. There's also a blue dotted line which is the CPU temperature trend line, which can help to make snap judgments of how each cooler is performing relative to the group. The grey bar tracks average frames per second of the benchmarks. They don't generally shift much on an open-air test bench, so I wouldn't be too concerned about watching over them. However, I do think it's useful to present 2 data types for full test transparency. We also have some error bars on the FPS and thermal bars. We have plus or minus 1 degree Celsius on the temperatures and plus or minus 2% on the FPS bars. These should help to account for some variations in the tests. And finally, the CPU we're using is a 91W TDP i7-6700K at 1.2 volts and 4 GHz, and the graphics card is an EVGA GTX 1070 for the win, running at 2000 MHz. So without further ado, let's skip through to the Firestrike's physics test and go from there. Here's where perhaps sorting by CPU cooler volume would make more sense. Having the Legrand Macho RT next to the Hyper 212 Evo just seems cruel. Anyway, performance-wise, there's virtually no difference between the Rev.B and RT. We're talking less than 1 degree Celsius here, which is within tolerance. However, the RT is holding up against the competition, but within tolerance of all the 160mm coolers, apart from the H5 Universal. Moving on to the combined test results from Firestrike, the RT slips just behind most of the 160mm coolers, but we're still talking within tolerance. Same situation goes for the Rev.B, which logged down a cooler result than the RT. However, it's only 0.3 degrees Celsius, so it's not exactly a clean victory. Skipping past Unison Heaven and over to Unison Superposition, this is a very low CPU intensive task. You can see further up the graph higher temperatures can be reached, but as for larger coolers further down, they're all fighting within tolerance markers. But the RT has made a slight break from the pack, just over 1 degree Celsius cooler than the Rev.B. Nothing to write home about, but it is something. In search of higher CPU loads, we're shifting past Dirt 3 and Dirt Showdown onto Rise of the Tomb Raider. While the Rise of RT, yeah, kind of works, is ahead of the 160mm coolers, it's a chunk behind the Mugen 5, which after repeating testing, showed a consistently low temperature in this test. The Rev.B isn't a world behind the D15S though, which you may have noticed is consistently a high performer. Hitman sees both Macho coolers falling second place to the D15S and barely ahead of the Mugen 5, but nicely ahead of the Dark Rock 4. And just before we find out which of these is the ultimate cooler with Prime 95, GTA sees the RT pull ahead once more, and the Rev.B is right next to the Dark Rock 4 and D15S. So now to find out if the Legrand Macho RT can outperform the rest of the competition and back up its extraordinary size with some results. Well, that turns out to be a negative. Both the Rev.B and RT fall behind the D15S, Dark Rock 4 and Mugen 5, although they were very close to the last two. I think what we're seeing here is that this CPU isn't enough to show how capable either of these coolers are. That's not discrediting the designs of the other coolers. I think their performance is based on more efficient designs and work more effectively at this TDP level than something like the RT. To really find out what something like the Macho RT is capable of, it would need a CPU closer to its 300 watt TDP thermal capacity and 240 watt TDP respective to the Rev.B. Perhaps at those levels we'd see these graphs turn out substantially differently. I mean, the Dark Rock 4 is only rated for up to a 200 TDP CPU. Baseline is, I just don't think a 91 watt TDP 6700K can test these kinds of coolers effectively. So the final question really is, are any of these coolers worth it, the RT and Rev.B respectively? Well, it's difficult to say are they worth the cost, because the cost is different from region to region. I can't say globally they're worth this much and then you translate that into your region, because, I mean, some coolers are worth more or less than others and they sort of vary from region to region. So let's actually ask the question, are they worth it in comparison to other 160mm coolers we tested, the Noctua D15S, the Be Quiet Dark Rock 4, the Side Mugen 5, and the Cryrig H5 Universal? Well, we'll go through a pros, cons, positive, negatives of each component and compare them to the other coolers as quickly as I can. So starting off with the backplate, or the mounting solution as a whole, the backplate is way too busy. There's way too much going on. You need 4 pieces, you've got to put them together, and then it becomes the backplate you can use, in comparison to something like Noctua's backplate, the SecuFirm backplate. Not a fan of that sort of name of it, but the SecuFirm backplate has got all the bolts pre-fixed to a backplate. You slot it through, at least for the Intel ones, and it's in position. No problem. This one's got 4 pieces. Now, if you were closed-minded enough to say, it's just 4 pieces, you put them together, not a problem, you know, why are millennials complaining about these things? They're so easy. Back in my day, it was much harder, and for a start, shh, be quiet. Be quiet. You're clearly thinking in a very closed-minded fashion. Some people find it more difficult than others in life to do certain things. So I'm thinking from a more holistic point of view, you know, all-inclusively, is this the best mounting solution? Is it a good one? The answer is no. It's been done better. These are actually old designs. These are more aged designs than the other ones we've looked at, but you know, it's still not a good design. So having 4 bits and lots of them are fiddly and put in together is just ridiculous. If someone's got arthritis or sort of practical difficulties doing things, they're going to find it more difficult. So objectively, it's a worse design. There's also the hold down plate. That is just a world of confusion. There's no central post to keep it in the middle to make sure that you're mounting the plate centrally, although you can give it wiggle room. That does mean that you can move it slightly further away from the PCI Express card that you have in this position. So yeah, fair enough, there has a certain pro to it, but having it sort of slide around is one thing, but also having it not being able to mount it to a vertical motherboard, you have to mount it to a horizontal motherboard, is a different thing entirely. There's also the issue of, before we even get to the hold down plate in terms of installation, having the screws on the back of the back plate can potentially, and they did in my case, they started turning rather than gripping to the backplate. It means then that you need access to that backplate, and that becomes difficult if you've got the motherboard installed into a case that doesn't have access to that backplate. Now, that is rare, it's generally few and far between, but it's still a point to be made and still something for you to consider when looking at either of these coolers and their mounting solutions. A step on from that, generally the second worst part when it comes to coolers is the mounting of the fans. They're not as bad as something like the Dark Rock 4. I found the Dark Rock 4's mounting mounting solution to be, you know, quite ridiculous. They did it better on the Dark Rock 3's design, where they actually had sort of tabs to be able to pull on. These ones they pull from the front, similar in sense to the ones on the Macho RT. But anyway, the mounting pressure was way too high. These ones are much more relaxed. They're a bit weird, bit fiddly still, you know, no concise hooks into either of the pieces, so a bit irritating, but, you know, not as good as other coolers, which have sort of the traditional tab on the CPU cooler side, not the fan side, but they're not as bad as the Dark Rock 4s. And finally, I think objectively, the thermals aren't great, but I just don't think, like I alluded to just as I ended the thermal testing sort of analysis part, I just don't think we can test them thoroughly and find out where the weaknesses and strengths are in these coolers when it comes to a 91 watt TDP CPU. This one on the RT is rated 300 watt TDP CPU. The Rev.B is rated for 240 watts. The closest one to that is the Dark Rock 4, which we tested, which is rated for 200 watts. So, you know, if you really wanted to pick apart, you know, how these really perform in comparison to the other ones, you really should be pushing the thermal limit up to see that. But this has to be said, most people don't own, like, you know, CPUs that are above 100 watts. You know, 100 watts is as far as you really go in terms of the consumer class of CPUs. So taking that into account, then they're not really worth it. If this costs more than something like a D15S or a Mugen 5, Mugen 5 performed very well, especially considering its size, then, you know, you're better off going with a Mugen 5 because it's a bit smaller, it performs better in a lot of circumstances, or nearly as good, and it's most likely a little bit cheaper, and it's smaller again, but that makes it way easier for compatibility. That'll fit in a mini ITX build, the RT pretty much won't. So I think that all there is remaining to be said is thank you so much for checking this video out. If you did like it or didn't like it, please like or dislike the video and let me know what I should improve or remove so I can improve these videos for the future. If you are interested, or if you want to check out what the price is in your respective region, again, you can head to the Amazon affiliate links in the video description, and if you buy anything through those affiliate links, then there will be a small kickback to the channel between 4 and 12%. If you're looking forward to the return of case reviews, which was our mainstay, we're going back to our grassroots, and we are kicking off with the Thermaltake level 20 VT off to my right, just out of arm's reach, and we will be, that will hopefully be up on the channel within the next week and a half, 2 weeks as of the upload of this video. So if you want to go any further than that, though, you can head over to the Patreon and you can support the channel that way by donating a certain amount or whatever amount you fancy. Any amount that comes through to the channel will certainly help us review more interesting things in more interesting ways. So thank you so much for all my current patrons for all of your support. I will be selling all these random bits of stuff to people on Patreon if they want to pick them up for a largely discounted price from the price that I picked them up for, and hopefully get a bit of a deal on there as a bit of a, you know, thank you for supporting the channel. So thanks guys, I will catch you in the next one. See you then guys, bye bye.